Hey everyone. In this episode, I will look at how can we map HTTP headers into our GraphQL execution context, and also how can we output HTTP headers. So how can we rewrite the HTTP request to include some response headers of our choosing? By the way, we are running workshops at multiple conferences throughout the year. If you want to spend 2 days with Martin and me diving deep into GraphQL concepts, GraphQL in the .NET ecosystem, and how to build reactive applications with React and Relay, join us. If you like our content, please hit the like and subscribe button below the video. And with that, let's dive in. So I already prepared our famous example here, and we will look today at how we can integrate HTTP headers into this example. So first thing is, how can we access headers in our resolvers? So the easiest way, but also not the cleanest way, is just to access the HTTP context in our resolver. Let's do that. I have added here the author resolver, and in the author resolver class, I introduced a new field getAddress. So an address field, the resolver here gets injected the HTTP context, and the HTTP context in our case is something that we inject into the global request state every time we create a GraphQL request. The one ugliest thing here is that we kind of have to provide the key here. The key is the name of the HTTP context class. And the other thing is that we are now dealing with HTTP context related stuff in our resolvers. But before I show you how to make that actually better, let's try that out. So I'm already running our server here. Let's go to Banana Cake Pop. Let's create a new tab. And now let's just write a simple query here to get the address field. So as you see, I run that and I get no address header. And that's because I didn't specify any headers. So I can go down here to the headers tab, and then we can just add the address header. It's a custom header that we came up with, so it's nothing standardized. And then we just say New York, not really an address, but more a city, but it doesn't matter. I rerun that, and then I get here the thing I provided through my headers. So how can we actually make that better? So let's go back to VS Code, and we introduce a new thing here, and that's called the HTTP request interceptor. So I created here a simple class called custom request interceptor, and we are inheriting here from the default HTTP request interceptor. This interceptor allows us to get a hook into the creation of a GraphQL request in the HTTP middleware. And you can see that in the onCreateAsync method here, we get passed in the HTTP context the request executor on which our request will be executed, the query request builder, and that is essentially a builder to build up the GraphQL request itself, and a cancellation token. So the method is also async, so we even could load something from the database if we wanted to. Not really the best thing because it would slow down our request, but you can do a lot of things in here. And one thing in particular that we do here and what you should do here is build up state. What I mean with state is, for instance, that we could map headers into the global request state. Let's do that, for instance. Let's take the address header and map it as a global state to our request. And for this, I'm going to my resolver here. I'm just copying this guy here, and then we copy that over to our interceptor. But instead of returning the data here, we're going to take our request builder, and then we set the global state. You can see there's a helper method called setGlobalState. We can give that a name, address, for instance, and then we can pass the value into our global state here. And since the value actually from the headers is a string value here, string values, we can also cast that to our desired string here. And then the conversion is already done here at the request level, so once instead of per resolver. Okay, with this, we can go back to our resolver actually. And then in our resolver, we rewrite this logic. We inject here the address from our global state, but it actually can be nullable because sometimes if it's not there, it's not there. And then our resolver also looks much nicer because we just check here if address is there. If not, then we return the no address header. And now our resolver code is also much cleaner because we just check here if address is set. So if we have address value. If not, we are returning no address header. And the cool thing around this is even if this comes over a socket, so if we don't have any headers, we could fill up the global state with address for that transport, and then still our resolver would work. We kind of have abstracted our resolver from the actual transport here. So let's try that out in Banana K-pop. Go over here and I rerun that. We get no address header, which is strange, but actually, let me go back. We forgot one step, and that was down here where we defined our custom request interceptor. We never registered it with our GraphQL configuration. Let's do that. So I chain in after the add types, the add request interceptor here. And it actually doesn't matter where you chain it in. Everything after GraphQL server is fine, right? There's no ordering requirement here. And then we go back to Banana Cake Pop, rerun that, and we get now the header. So that's how it should work. And if we switch that off, we get the no address header. Okay, this is awesome. This is how we can work with headers on the input side. So how we get headers into our request, but how can we output headers? So essentially create response headers. For this, let's go back to VS Code. If we want to change the way Hot Chocolate does format the HTTP responses, we need to introduce a new custom HTTP response formatter. So let me do that here. And we have to implement here the iHTTP response formatter interface. And you can see there are two methods that we need to implement. I don't want to implement all these methods. So we are taking the default response formatter here. And I'm just wiring up here the methods that we have to implement. So in this case, I'm creating the request flags. And the second thing I want to do is now implement the format async. And I just actually want to create response headers here. So we're gonna leave this method actually also as it is and just wire up the formatter. And why I'm doing this is actually because there are a lot of cases that you would have to implement if you implemented the full formatter here. So we just rely on the default implementation and just add the part that we need extra. So we store in the GraphQL engine the response headers or things that we want to transfer to the response headers in the result state. The result state is essentially a dictionary on the result object here called context data. So we can check if it has something in it. Then we can check maybe if it has a certain response header for us. Let's say we stored it as a property called some header. And then we can take that value and use the response object that we have up there to create the response header. Okay, so this is now set up. My formatter is ready. So let's register it. And the response formatter in this case is registered globally because it's used for all the transport stuff. If you have multiple schemas, we will use the same formatter for all the schemas. The question now is, how do we get out of the resolver the values into the response context data or in the response state? Let me show you. The response state cannot be mutated out of the resolver. For this, we need a middleware. So I created here a descriptor attribute, more clearly an object field descriptor attribute. So this can be annotated on resolvers. And now we're going to implement some middleware logic here. We can use this attribute with multiple headers. So I'm introducing here a name property. And the name property here represents the header name. So with this in place, we can now create our middleware here. And the middleware, again, we use the use descriptor on the field descriptor and then start with the typical middleware delegate. So next, then we create the actual middleware delegate. So this is a factory pattern. This guy actually creates our middleware delegate here. And our middleware delegate has context, and that is the middleware context. And in our case, we're gonna invoke just next. And then when we have back control, so the rest of the pipeline has been executed, we're gonna look in the local state of the resolver. So context, get local state, and in our case, get local state or default, and then we pass in the name of our header, capture it as a header value, and if that header value is not null, we're gonna write it to the response context data. The response context data in Hot Chocolate 13 is available on the middleware context, and it's called operation result, and there we have the set result state, and we can use the name again, and then just copy over the value. So the local state here, that's the interesting part, it's only available in our resolver. So we have a couple of state objects, like there is the request state or the global state. We have the scoped state, there's the local state, and there's the response state. Okay, with this done, let's use it. So I'm adding here the attribute, and then in our response formatter, we actually said there's only one header we look at, that's the sum header. We could organize that slightly different to make it dynamic, but in our case, I'm just filling that in here. In order to mutate the local state of my resolver, I injected here the local state with a set state delegate, and that actually allows me to mutate the state of my resolver here. The same goes for global state. You can do the same with that, and also scoped state here. With that injected, we can just take that here and then provide any value that we want. For instance, ABC. Let's test that in Banana Cake Pop. So I'm here, I'm rerunning that. And now I go to transport details. And there you can see the request headers, and there the response headers, and there we can see some header ABC. So this worked quite nicely. In this video, we have learned how we can handle HTTP specific things like headers and pass them into our GraphQL engine without introducing dependencies onto the transport layer. And we also looked at the reverse way, like creating state in our resolver and then transferring it off with the result state so that the transport layer then can make something transport specific with it. Same would go for sockets. We have a socket interceptor and we could do things there as well. As we go along, we could make that even easier by allowing to inject essentially a mutator to the result state into the resolver. At the moment, this is not possible. You have to have a middleware. So we had to have this extra step there. But Hot Chocolate, anyway, gets easier by each version. If you want to help our project, please go to GitHub and give us a GitHub star. This really helps us grow the community. Did you already have the case where you interacted or wanted to interact with headers? Sound off in the comments. And with this, I'm out.